Hello, Father Morris with you again. By this time, we're pretty far into Lent, and hopefully a lot of you have been out to the St. Luke fish fry, the John the Baptist Parish fish fry at St. Luke, with the Knights of Columbus out there. But sometimes the question comes up, like, what's the deal with fish? Well, some of you might be old enough to remember when Catholics were called fish eaters as a derogatory term, and that you had to, on every Friday of the year, refrain from eating meat. So in the past, during most of our lifetimes now, that has been changed so that only during Lent, then that we observe abstinence on Fridays in Lent, that we abstain from flesh meat. But people always, but why is fish okay? Why is eggs and butter okay? And it really goes back to historically that we have to, again, kind of go back in time here, where nowadays we think of fish as a very healthy thing. That's what Japanese eat and live to be 90. But when we think back to medieval times in Europe, or even between the fall of the Roman Empire and the so-called Dark Ages, whatever. But when we think back to then, think of like a peasant in just medieval Germany, medieval France. They were not exactly eating hamburgers all the time. They were usually eating some sort of porridge of made out of wheat or anything. Foodstuffs that they have grown, and so it's a very subsistence diet. And the idea of eating flesh meat, you wouldn't have access to it. That's why you see paintings of like the kings and stuff have giant fowls on their kitchen tables for this feast, because no one else would have, a peasant would never had access to that. They were just too poor, and so peasants, one of the major sources for protein, of course, was fish, that you were allowed to fish. So there was this association that fish was for poor people, flesh meat was for rich people. So that was part of the reason of switching over to observing abstinence from meat. It's that not that meat is bad, but it's because it was expensive. And so even today, if you think of the difference between a can of tuna or going to Whole Foods and getting grass-fed, beef or something like that, there is a price differential. So we still even see that in our own day. Now, in other countries where fish isn't really plentiful, or the species isn't edible, you'll get some weird exceptions made. So in South America, famously, you can eat capybara, which is kind of think like a giant muskrat, because the fish in the Amazon area there, the tribes can't eat. So they're allowed to substitute with that. I believe New Orleans used to have permission that you could eat alligator, or and alligator counted as fish, because again, the idea was, okay, what's food that poor people would eat because they have to, because they're starving, but you as a normal person would probably never seek out and eat. That is try to identify with the poor. So that's some of the broad outlines of why we eat fish during Lent. But the idea is that, okay, if we were buying, again, expensive food normally, that during Lent, by switching to cheaper food, we now have excess funds that we can do almsgiving with, that we can give to those who are less fortunate. So again, the difference between buying 89-cent can of tuna versus buying grass-fed steak, the differential there, that we can give that then to the poor as well. So we're not only doing something for ourselves, we're also doing something for the larger community. So broadly speaking, that's the idea behind us observing abstinence. It's not because fish is holier or that meat is bad. And obviously the rest of the year we don't, we can eat meat. So it's not that. It's rooted in the idea of, like, what can we do as a penance that will help us to identify with the poor, to help the poor, but also help us to identify with the sufferings of Christ. Because we know, again, every Friday is a day of penance, since we have Good Friday, the day that Christ died. And as I said, for most of us, that the bishop said you could either continue to eat meat on Fridays as abstinence, or you could substitute another penance or good work. Again, being good Catholics, we just heard you can eat meat on Fridays, and everyone else forgot about the other part. So to this day, you can still observe abstinence on Friday, or do another penance to fulfill your Friday obligation to remember in some way the passion of our Lord. So again, I hope that helps a little bit for us to understand why fish fries are such a thing, why fish is such a focus for us during Lent, and maybe historically to help us understand the value that we had when we were publicly identified as fish eaters, because every Friday we had to seek out fish instead of meat. That was really a clear witness to the wider culture of us doing some kind of corporal penance together. But anyway, hope you have a good rest of Lent, and see you at the St. Luke Fish Fry. God bless.